I still remember the exact second it happened, because the room went quiet in a way that felt violent. One moment there was laughter, the clinking of glasses, the soft hum of expensive music, and the next moment it was like someone had sucked all the air out of my lungs. I was standing at my own son's engagement party, holding a glass of sparkling water because I don't drink anymore, when his future in-laws looked me up and down, smiled that thin, cruel smile, and laughed not with me, at me. They joked about how simple I looked, about how lucky my son was to escape my small world, and how ironic it was that someone like me had raised a man who now belonged in their circle. And I stood there, my hands shaking, my heart pounding, and I said the words that changed everything. This company is mine. Before you judge me, before you decide whether I was petty or justified or completely unhinged, tell me honestly, what would you have done if you were humiliated in front of everyone you loved at the one moment that was supposed to be about your child's happiness? To understand how I got to that moment, you need to know who I am and, more importantly, who I was before that night. I'm a woman who learned very early that the world doesn't hand you respect just because you deserve it. I grew up in a small apartment with peeling paint and a mother who worked herself into the ground and still smiled when she came home. My father left when I was young, and the lesson I learned wasn't that men are unreliable, but that security is fragile. I promised myself I would never depend on anyone else to survive. I studied, I worked, I failed, I started again. I built things with my own hands and my own mind, quietly, without applause. And when I had my son, he became the center of my universe. Every choice I made was filtered through one question. Will this give him a better life than the one I had? I was young when I had him, younger than most of my friends, and I remember the looks I got pushing a stroller while still carrying textbooks in my bag. People assumed things about me. They always do. They assumed I was careless, irresponsible, uneducated. I learned to let them think whatever they wanted, because correcting them took energy I needed for more important things. I worked 2 jobs while finishing my degree. I took night shifts, early mornings, anything that paid. When my son was asleep, I studied. When he was awake, I was present. I missed parties, relationships, vacations. I missed being carefree. But I never missed a parent, teacher meeting, never missed a bedtime story unless I physically couldn't get home in time. I taught him kindness, humility, and the value of work. I also taught him not to judge people by appearances, though ironically, that lesson would come back to haunt me. The company, yes, the company didn't start as some grand vision. It started as a solution to a problem I understood deeply. I saw inefficiencies, gaps that people with money didn't notice because they'd never struggled the way I had. I took a risk that scared me so badly I threw up the night before I signed the papers. I invested everything I had, including money I couldn't afford to lose. There were months when I wondered if I destroyed my son's future chasing an impossible dream. But slowly, painfully, it worked. Clients came, then bigger clients. I hired people. I expanded. And still, I stayed invisible. I didn't put my face on magazines or attend flashy events. I didn't want my son to feel like money was the point of life. I wanted him to feel grounded, normal. By the time my son was in college, we were comfortable, not extravagantly wealthy in the way people imagine, but secure. The kind of secure where medical bills didn't terrify me anymore, where I could plan for the future. He never went without, but he also never knew exactly how much I had. I drove a modest car. I wore simple clothes. I liked it that way. Money can distort people, and I wanted him to choose his path without the weight of my success influencing him. Maybe that was my first mistake. He met her in his final year of college. Let's call her Lena. She was beautiful in a polished, effortless way. Confident, well-spoken. She came from a family that valued appearances, status, and tradition. The first time he brought her home, I tried my best to make her feel welcome. I cooked all day, cleaned every corner of the apartment, even though by then I could have afforded help. Old habits die hard. She was polite, but distant, like she was observing rather than participating. Her parents, I learned later, were even worse. From the start, there was a subtle tension. Lena's mother asked pointed questions about my job, my background, my education, all wrapped in a smile that never reached her eyes. Her father barely spoke to me at all, except to correct my pronunciation of a word once, publicly, as if to establish some kind of hierarchy. I told myself I was being sensitive. I didn't want to cause problems for my son. He was in love, and love makes people blind in ways that are beautiful and terrifying. When he told me he wanted to propose, I cried, not because I disapproved, but because I knew my role in his life was changing. That's the quiet grief no one talks about when you're a single mother who raised a child alone. You don't just gain a partner for your child, you lose a version of your relationship with them. I hugged him, told him I was proud, told him I trusted his judgment, and I meant it. I also knew that engagement meant merging families, and that scared me more than I wanted to admit. The engagement party was hosted by Lena's family. Of course it was. They chose a venue that screamed wealth, high ceilings, crystal chandeliers, waiters in tailored suits. I agonized over what to wear, not because I wanted to impress them, but because I didn't want to embarrass my son. In the end, I chose a simple, elegant dress, nothing flashy, something that felt like me. I arrived early alone, because my son and Lena were taking photos. I stood near the edge of the room, smiling at strangers, feeling like I was back in that small apartment again, pretending I belonged somewhere I wasn't sure I was welcome. As the night went on, the comments started, small at first, jokes about how refreshing it was that I wasn't one of those pushy, image-obsessed mothers. Remarks about how my son must have worked so hard to rise above his circumstances. Each comment was a needle, small enough that if I reacted, I'd look dramatic. So I smiled, I nodded, I swallowed the bitterness rising in my throat. I told myself it was just one night. Then came the moment that broke me. Lena's father, surrounded by his friends and relatives, gestured toward me and laughed. He said something about how it was inspiring, that someone like me had managed to raise such a successful son, considering where I came from. Someone else chimed in, joking about how I must be thrilled that my son was marrying into real wealth now. They laughed, people looked at me, waiting to see how I'd react. I felt my face burn. I thought of every night I'd stayed awake worrying about bills, every sacrifice I'd made, every ounce of myself I'd poured into building a future for my child. And I realized something in that moment. They didn't just see me as lesser. They saw me as a stepping stone my son had outgrown. That's when I spoke, not loudly, not dramatically. I didn't raise my voice or slam a glass. I simply said, "This company is mine," and the room changed. But that's not where this story really begins. And it's definitely not where it ends. Because before those words left my mouth, there was a lifetime of choices, secrets, and compromises that led me there. And before you decide whether I was right or wrong, you need to know exactly what I'd been holding back, what I'd hidden even from my own son, and why staying silent suddenly felt like the biggest betrayal of all to myself. After I said those words, I didn't immediately explain myself. I didn't need to, not yet. Part of me wanted to take them back, to laugh it off and say I was joking, because I could already feel the weight of what I'd just done. But another part of me, the part that had survived alone for decades, felt strangely calm. Still, to understand why that calm existed, you have to go back again, further than the engagement party, further even than my son's childhood, back to the years when I first learned how invisible a woman can be when she doesn't fit into the boxes society prefers. When my son was about 5 years old, I was still struggling. I had finished my degree by then, but degrees don't magically turn into money, especially when you don't have connections. I worked at a mid-sized firm where I was constantly overlooked. I watched men with less experience get promoted ahead of me, listened to managers praise my ideas only to later present them as their own. I was told to be patient, to be grateful, to smile more, and I did for a while because I had a child to feed. But inside, something hardened. I realized that waiting for recognition was a luxury I couldn't afford. That's when I started working on my idea in secret. Late nights, spreadsheets spread across my tiny kitchen table, my son asleep in the next room. I taught myself things no one had taught me. I read contracts I barely understood at first, watched online lectures, reached out to people who didn't reply. I failed more times than I can count. There were moments I sat on the bathroom floor, crying silently so my son wouldn't hear, convinced I was being selfish for risking stability for ambition. But every time I thought about quitting, I imagined my son grown up, standing in a room full of people who looked down on him because of where he came from. And that fear pushed me forward. When the company finally started gaining traction, I kept it quiet. Even at work, I didn't tell anyone. I was terrified someone would sabotage me, steal the idea, or worse, laugh at me. Women learn early that confidence is often punished, especially when it isn't accompanied by the right background. So I let people underestimate me. It was easier that way. When I eventually left my job to focus on my company full-time, I framed it as a career break. People nodded sympathetically, assuming I'd burned out or failed. I let them think that. As the years passed, the company grew faster than I ever expected. We landed contracts with firms I'd once dreamed of working for. I hired a team, many of them women who reminded me of myself. Talented, overlooked, tired of waiting. I paid them fairly. I listened to them. I created the kind of workplace I wished I'd had. But still, I stayed out of the spotlight. I didn't put my name on the door. I registered the company under a neutral brand, nothing flashy, nothing that screamed power. I told myself it was about humility, about focus. The truth is, part of me was still afraid of being seen. My son grew up watching me work hard, but he never saw the full picture. He knew I had a business. He knew we were doing okay. But he didn't know the scale, the influence, the nights I spent negotiating deals that could have changed everything overnight. I thought I was protecting him. I didn't want him to feel entitled or pressured. I wanted him to believe his achievements were his own. And they were. He was smart, kind, driven. I'm proud of him in ways that have nothing to do with money. But by hiding that part of myself, I also hid a truth about who I was. When Lena entered his life, I tried harder than ever to shrink myself. Around her family, I downplayed my work even more. I spoke vaguely, let them fill in the gaps with their assumptions. I watched as they praised ambition in others, but dismissed it in me. Lena herself wasn't openly cruel at first, but she absorbed her parents' attitudes without question. She corrected me sometimes, the way her father did. She spoke over me in conversations. She thanked me for my support of my son, as if I were a volunteer in his life, rather than the person who built it from scratch. There were moments I considered telling my son the truth. Little moments, like when Lena's mother suggested I might enjoy retiring, now that my son was marrying well, or when her father joked about how nice it must be to finally have security. Each time I swallowed my words. I didn't want to put him in the middle. I didn't want to look like I was competing with his future wife's family. I told myself love required sacrifice, and silence was my sacrifice. But silence has a cost. It chips away at you slowly. By the time the engagement party arrived, I was already exhausted, not physically, but emotionally. I felt like I'd been performing a role for years. The grateful, humble mother who should be thankful her son was moving up. And when they laughed at me that night, something inside me snapped. Not because they hurt my pride, but because they erased my humanity. They reduced my entire life to a joke. After I said, "This company is mine," there was confusion. Lena's father frowned, clearly trying to decide whether I was serious. Someone laughed nervously. I didn't elaborate. I didn't need to right then. The damage, or revelation, had already been done. But as the night continued, the atmosphere shifted. People looked at me differently. Questions started forming behind their eyes. Lena avoided me. My son looked confused, concerned, curious. I could tell he wanted to ask me something, but the moment wasn't right. Later that night, when the party was winding down, my son finally pulled me aside. He asked me what I meant. His voice wasn't angry, but it wasn't calm either. It was the voice of someone realizing there's a whole part of their parent they never knew. I looked at him, really looked at him, and I realized I couldn't hide anymore. Not from him, not from myself. But before I could explain, Lena appeared, her face tight, her smile forced. She said we'd talk later. She said it like a command, and that's when I knew this wasn't just about pride or respect anymore. It was about power, about control, about who gets to define who's worth. I went home that night feeling lighter and heavier at the same time. Lighter because I'd finally spoken a truth I'd buried for years. Heavier because I knew there would be consequences. Secrets don't disappear quietly when they're exposed. They explode. So that's where things stood. My son questioning everything he thought he knew about me. His future in-laws reassessing me through a lens they never expected to use. And me standing at a crossroads. I'd avoided my entire life. I could retreat again, smooth things over, minimize what I'd said, or I could finally claim my space, no matter who it upset. And I hadn't even reached the hardest part yet. The days after the engagement party were some of the most uncomfortable of my life, because everything was out in the open without actually being said. My son started calling me more often, but the conversations felt careful, like he was circling something fragile and didn't know how to touch it without breaking it. Lena, on the other hand, went completely silent. No messages, no polite check-ins, nothing. And her parents, well, they moved fast. People like them always do when they feel their sense of control slipping. I first realized something was shifting when one of my senior managers called me, her voice tight with concern. She asked if I knew that representatives from a partner family had requested a private meeting with our legal team, claiming there had been a misunderstanding about ownership. When she said the name, my stomach dropped. It was Lena's father's company. The same company that had been bragging all night at the engagement party about their influence, their reach, their legacy. The same company that, unbeknownst to most people in that room, existed in a business ecosystem I'd helped shape. That's when it hit me. They hadn't just mocked me. They had underestimated me in a way that could now hurt people I was responsible for. My employees, my team, women and men who trusted me to protect what we'd built together. And suddenly, staying quiet wasn't just a personal choice anymore. It was a liability. I agreed to the meeting, but on my terms. Neutral location, lawyers present, everything documented. When the day came, I walked into that boardroom wearing the same kind of simple outfit I always wore. Not because I wanted to make a statement, but because this was my armor. Across the table sat Lena's father, her uncle, and two advisors who clearly believed they were about to intimidate a naive woman into backing down. The irony would have been funny if it hadn't been so insulting. They spoke first, they always do, They framed the conversation as a clarification, suggested that I had misspoken at the engagement party, that perhaps I'd exaggerated my role. They implied that the company I owned was actually dependent on their network, that without their goodwill, things could become difficult. I listened. I let them talk themselves into a corner, and then I slid the documents across the table. I watched their expressions change as they realized exactly how wrong they were. Ownership percentages, acquisition history, contracts they'd signed years ago without reading the fine print closely enough. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't smile. I simply stated facts. This company was mine, not partially, not symbolically, fully, and the leverage they thought they had over me didn't exist. When the meeting ended, they were polite. Cold but polite, and that scared me more than their arrogance ever had. Because polite people with wounded pride don't forget. They plot. Around this time, my son finally confronted me properly. He came over one evening, unannounced, standing in my doorway with that familiar mix of frustration and vulnerability that reminded me so painfully of when he was a teenager. He asked me why I hadn't told him the truth, not accusing, just genuinely hurt, and for the first time, I told him everything. The failures, the risks, the fear, the reason I stayed invisible. I told him I didn't want my success to overshadow his life or choices. I told him I was scared money would change how he saw me. He listened quietly, and when I finished, he said something that broke my heart a little. He said he wished I'd trusted him enough to share that part of myself. He said he felt like he'd been defending people who looked down on me without even realizing it. And then he asked me the question I'd been dreading. Was Lena like that too? I didn't answer immediately. Because, as much as I wanted to protect him, I also didn't want to poison his relationship with my bitterness. I told him the truth, but gently. I said Lena had grown up in a world where worth was measured loudly, publicly, and often cruelly. I said she wasn't evil, but she was shaped by people who believed status was everything. And I told him that love sometimes requires unlearning things, not just feeling them. He left that night quieter than he arrived, and in the silence that followed, I wondered if I'd just set off a chain reaction I couldn't control. The pressure escalated quickly after that. Lena's parents began suggesting changes to the wedding plans that conveniently excluded me from key decisions. Venues I wasn't invited to see, guest lists finalized without my input, traditions framed as family only, with the clear implication that I wasn't really family in their eyes. Lena herself became distant with my son, critical in ways she hadn't been before. She questioned his loyalty, hinted that my sudden confidence was embarrassing, that I was trying to compete with her parents. Watching this from the outside was torture. Every instinct in me wanted to step in, to shield him, to fix it. But this wasn't my battle to fight directly. This was his moment to see clearly, to decide what kind of future he wanted. All I could do was stand firm in my own truth and refuse to be diminished again. And this is where I need to pause and talk to you directly, because this is the point in the story where everything could have gone in a completely different direction. Imagine you're me for a moment. You've spent your whole life making yourself smaller to keep the peace. Now that you've finally stood up for yourself, the people who benefited from your silence are pushing back, and it's affecting your child's relationship. Do you apologize to restore harmony? Do you step back into the shadows for his sake? Or do you hold your ground, even if it means risking his happiness? Before I tell you what I did next, I want you to stop for a second and think about what you would have done in my place. Because this choice changed everything. What I did wasn't impulsive. It was the result of years of swallowing my voice, of watching powerful people rewrite reality to suit themselves. I decided that if I was going to be painted as a problem, I might as well be an honest one. I stopped attending events where I was clearly unwelcome. I communicated only through my son when necessary, calmly and respectfully. I focused on my work, on protecting my company and my people from any fallout. And when Lena's parents attempted to apply pressure through social channels, spreading subtle rumors about my instability and ambition, I documented everything. My son began to see things he hadn't before. He noticed how Lena spoke about money, about levels of people, about how embarrassing it would be if certain truths became public. He noticed how often she defended her parents' behavior while dismissing my feelings. And slowly, painfully, the image he had of their future together began to crack. The final straw came during a private dinner that I wasn't invited to, but heard about afterward. Lena's father reportedly joked that once the wedding happened, they wouldn't have to deal with me anymore because my son would finally be on their side. When my son confronted Lena about it, she didn't deny it. She told him it was just how her family talked, that it wasn't a big deal, that I was too sensitive. And that's when he realized something that took me decades to learn. Love that requires you to shrink yourself, or the people you love, isn't love at all. What happened next was messy, painful. There were tears, arguments, ultimatums. The engagement didn't end quietly, and it certainly didn't end politely. But it ended honestly, and as much as it broke my heart to see my son in pain, I also saw something else in his eyes for the first time: clarity. We're not at the end yet, not even close. Because when pride is wounded and control is lost, people don't just walk away. They retaliate, and Lena's family wasn't done trying to remind me of my place. They just underestimated how far I was willing to go to protect my dignity, my child, and the life I'd built with my own two hands. When the engagement officially ended, the world didn't stop spinning, but it felt like it did inside our little bubble. The silence afterward was louder than any argument that came before it. My son moved through his days like someone relearning how to breathe. He questioned everything: his judgment, his future, the people he had trusted, and I questioned myself in a different way. I asked whether I could have prevented this if I'd been braver earlier, louder earlier, more honest earlier. That kind of guilt is a uniquely maternal one. Even when your child makes the right choice, you still wonder if you set the stage for their pain. But Lena's family wasn't interested in reflection or healing. For them, this wasn't about a broken engagement. It was about a public loss of face. In their world, reputation is currency, and they felt robbed. So they did what powerful, entitled people often do when they don't get their way. They tried to punish me. It started subtly. Contracts delayed without explanation, industry events where my company was suddenly overlooked. Partners who'd been warm and collaborative became distant, cautious. I recognized the pattern immediately. I'd seen it before, from the other side of the table, when men with fragile egos tried to freeze me out for daring to exist beyond the role they assigned me. The difference this time was that I wasn't alone and I wasn't afraid. I called a meeting with my leadership team and told them the truth, not the emotional details, but the reality of the situation. I explained that there might be pressure, that certain doors might temporarily close, but that our foundation was solid. I promised transparency and protection, and then I watched something extraordinary happen. They didn't panic. They didn't doubt me. They rallied. People who believe in you will do that when you've earned their trust. In that moment, I realized that everything I'd built quietly, humbly, had given me something far more powerful than status, loyalty. Meanwhile, my son and I were rebuilding our relationship in a new way, without secrets, without that unspoken imbalance where I was always protecting him from the truth. We talked more honestly than we ever had, about his childhood, about my fears, about his heartbreak. He admitted that part of him had enjoyed the validation of being accepted by Lena's family, that it felt like proof he'd made it. Saying that out loud embarrassed him, but I didn't judge him. I told him, It was human to want approval, especially when you grow up watching your parents struggle. What mattered was what he did once he saw the cost, and he did see it, clearly. He apologized to me one night in a way that made my chest ache. He said he was sorry for not defending me sooner, for not questioning the way people spoke about me. I told him there was nothing to forgive, that he was learning just like I was, that life doesn't hand you wisdom all at once. It hands it to you through pain. The retaliation escalated when Lena's father tried one last move. He reached out through intermediaries, proposing a mutually beneficial restructuring that would conveniently reduce my control over my own company in exchange for peace. It was framed as generosity, as a way to move on. I laughed when I read the proposal, not because it was funny, but because it was so predictable. They still believed I wanted their approval more than my autonomy. That's when I decided to stop playing defense. I authorized my legal team to proceed with actions we'd been holding back on perfectly legitimate, perfectly ethical actions that enforced boundaries that should have been respected years ago. Contracts were clarified, obligations were enforced, leverage was applied where leverage existed. I didn't do it out of spite. I did it out of necessity, and I did it calmly, methodically, without drama. Power doesn't need theatrics. It needs resolve. The fallout was swift. Lena's father's company took a public hit. Nothing scandalous, nothing illegal. Just the natural consequences of overreaching and underestimating someone they thought was beneath them. Industry whispers started, then conversations, then quiet acknowledgments that I had been the one holding certain systems together all along. People who had ignored me before suddenly wanted meetings. I declined most of them. I was no longer interested in being validated by the same circles that had dismissed me. Through all of this, Lena tried to reach out to my son, not to apologize, at least not genuinely, but to reframe the story in a way that preserved her family's image. She suggested time apart, counseling, distance from external influences. When my son told me this, his voice was steady in a way it hadn't been before. He said he finally understood the difference between partnership and performance. He ended things completely, kindly but firmly. And when he hung up the phone, he cried in my arms like he did when he was little, the way he hadn't in years. That night, after he fell asleep on my couch, I sat alone and let myself feel everything I'd been holding back. The anger, the relief, the grief, the pride. I thought about how close I'd come, so many times, to disappearing into the background forever. How easy it would have been to apologize at that engagement party, to laugh at myself, to accept their version of me. And I realized something that felt both painful and freeing. Silence had never protected my son. It had only protected the people who benefited from it. The aftermath wasn't neat or immediate. Healing never is. But slowly, life settled into a new rhythm. My company stabilized and then grew in directions I'd once been too cautious to pursue. My son rediscovered parts of himself that had been shrinking to fit into someone else's expectations. Our relationship transformed from one built on protection to one built on mutual respect. People still talk about that engagement party, about the moment the quiet woman revealed herself. Some frame it as revenge, some call it karma. For me, it wasn't about winning. It was about refusing to lose myself any longer. And that brings me to the final part of this story, because while the conflict ended, the lesson didn't. What happened changed how I see the world, how I see motherhood, and how I see power. And if you've ever been underestimated, dismissed, or told explicitly or subtly that you should know your place, then what I learned next might matter to you more than you think. The strangest thing about everything that happened is that once the noise faded, once the gossip moved on to its next target, and the tension finally loosened its grip, what I felt most wasn't triumph, it was peace. A quiet, steady kind of peace that comes from finally standing in your own truth without apology. For the first time in my life, I wasn't carrying the weight of being misunderstood by people who never cared to understand me in the first place. My son healed slowly, and I learned to let that process belong to him. I didn't rush him, didn't fill the silence with advice or reassurance. I just stayed. We cooked together more, talked late into the night. Sometimes we didn't talk at all. And in those quiet moments, I saw him becoming not just the man I raised, but the man he chose to be. Stronger, wiser, more discerning. He once told me that watching me refuse to be humiliated taught him more about self-respect than anything else ever had. Hearing that was worth every uncomfortable second I'd endured. As for me, I changed too. I stopped shrinking myself in rooms where I belonged. I spoke when I had something to say. I stopped explaining my worth to people who were committed to misunderstanding it. And perhaps most importantly, I stopped believing that being a good mother meant erasing myself for my child's comfort. Loving someone doesn't mean disappearing. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can teach is how to stand tall. Looking back now, I don't regret what I said at that engagement party. I regret how long it took me to say it. I regret every moment I doubted myself because it was easier than confronting someone else's prejudice. But regret is a teacher too, and I've learned to listen, so that's my story. A story about underestimation, about silence, about the cost of staying small, and the freedom that comes when you finally refuse to do it anymore. Was I wrong for speaking up that night? Would you have done the same thing if you were standing where I stood, being laughed at for a life you fought to build? If you were on my side, go ahead and like this video. Subscribe for more stories like this, because there are so many voices that deserve to be heard. And tell me in the comments, what would you have done in my place? I'll see you all in the next story.